I still remember the scent of chocolate cake that morning. It was strange. My mom had never baked before, not even for Thanksgiving or Christmas. She wasn't much of a cook. In fact, if she ever entered the kitchen, it was only to grab scissors to clip coupons from milk cartons. But that morning, she baked. That should have been my first sign. I had just turned 18, still wearing my faded gray pajamas. My hair tossed into a messy bun when Dad called me into the living room. He was already there sitting in his old leather chair, his back pressed against the cushion. His gaze was fixed firmly on the floor. Mom sat beside him, her hands tightly gripping her knees, avoiding my eyes. There was no smile, no birthday wishes, just silence. A silence so thick it felt suffocating. "Sit down." Dad's voice sliced through the air, low and cold, just like the time I'd broken the dining room lamp in 6th grade. I remembered the way he had spoken then, an odd calm before the storm. My heart dropped, and I could feel it, then the weight of what was coming. Everything I knew was about to collapse. Mom spoke first, each word stiff and rehearsed, as if she'd been practicing them for hours. "You were adopted." I froze. My mind stopped. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't blink. I didn't breathe. The world around me went silent, muted. I could hear my pulse in my ears. They didn't sound like they were talking to me, but to someone else. Someone who wasn't even real. "We brought you home when you were almost 3. Dad continued, his voice dull, devoid of emotion. "Your birth mother couldn't care for you. We did what we could." I swallowed hard, my eyes glued to a loose thread in the carpet. The words were blunt, mechanical. No warmth, no comfort. This wasn't a revelation. It was an announcement as detached as a business transaction. "It's time for you to go your own way." Mom's voice didn't quiver, but it was distant, as if she was speaking from a place she had long since left behind. Then Dad reached under his chair and pulled out a small canvas bag. He slid it toward me, and it hit the floor with a soft thud. The weight of it felt too much for its size. Just a few clothes, some cash, a temporary room at a motel. They were kicking me out on my 18th birthday. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I stood up slowly, my hands instinctively finding the edge of the canvas strap. The silence between us was unbearable, but I had learned long ago how to hide behind it. "Thank you." I said the words coming out too calmly. I picked up the bag, my fingers clutching it tightly. Too tightly. They had no idea that 3 weeks earlier, I had found something they never expected. It happened one night while I was searching for old records to fill out a scholarship form. I opened the hallway cabinet upstairs, the one where they kept tax returns and banking papers. At the very bottom, beneath a pile of dull folders, I found it. A yellow envelope, unsealed, scrawled with the name L. Wexler. I didn't know who that was, but what I found inside it stopped my heart. A copy of my birth certificate. My name was still there, Katie Monroe. But under Mother was a name I didn't recognize. Madison Wexler. The father's line was blank. I sat on the cold floor, my heart hammering. Madison Wexler. Who was she? For the next 3 weeks, I searched. I didn't ask anyone in the house. It was just me and the internet. I combed through everything I could find about her. And then I found it, the old articles buried, but still archived at the city library. Madison Wexler was a psychology researcher at a neurotherapy center in the northern suburbs. But then the scandal broke. She accused the center's director of misconduct during experimental treatments on women. A few months later, she was detained for unstable behavior and sent to a psychiatric facility, Maplewood Hills. The records stopped there. No more updates, no more photos. She disappeared after 2004. The more I read, the colder I felt. I didn't know if she was alive. I had never heard her name mentioned in our home. The question that kept me up, though, the one I couldn't shake, was why. Why was I the daughter of a whistleblower adopted by two people financially tied to the very center she exposed? My 18th birthday wasn't the day I lost a family. It was the day I realized I had been living in a carefully crafted lie. I left the house without looking back, the suburban home with the white porch and shuttered windows. It was nothing more than a stage set. A play I never signed up for. The motel they booked for me sat next to a highway. The air smelled like bleach-damp carpet and stale smoke. I couldn't sleep that night. The canvas bag sat by the bed, holding the only things I had left. 2 outfits, some loose change, and the yellow envelope I had hidden for weeks. The only thing of real value I owned. Early the next morning, I went to the city library, the only place I felt safe. I sat at the public computers, my hands still trembling, and typed Madison Wexler. This time, I dug deeper. No more news articles or public records. I searched through digital archives, leaked documents, investigative journalism forums, and then another name appeared connected to Madison's Dr. Colin Harrow. The name echoed in my mind, its weight heavier than I had anticipated. He was the former medical director of a private treatment center, the Harrow Institute for Integrated Mental Health. As I read through the documents from 2003 to 2004, everything about Madison's life there became painfully clear. She had been the lead specialist working with female patients until she filed an internal report on the Institute's unethical practices, unapproved drug trials, behavioral interventions without guardians, the kind of things you didn't just brush under the rug. 1 week after her report, she was suspended. A month later, she was institutionalized at Maplewood Hills for long-term observation. And then, she disappeared. Her records vanished. Her name ceased to exist in any official capacity. I printed everything, names, dates, connections, and shoved the papers into my coat pocket. I was already on my way out when a thought hit me. Greg Monroe. My father had once received letters from something called the Vail Foundation. I'd assumed it was just a charity, but now that same name, Vail Foundation, appeared in a footnote of one of the articles I had just printed. The Vail Foundation had supported the Harrow Institute from 2000 until its closure in 2005. My blood ran cold. Greg, just a regular adoptive dad? Or was he part of this entire system? I dug deeper. I pulled up public donation records. In 2011, a donor report listed Gregory Monroe as a distinguished benefactor to the Vail Foundation, with a note about a special contribution to post-recovery support programs. My chest tightened, suffocating. He had never talked about therapy, never mentioned hospitals, but he had donated to a foundation tied to the place where my mother was locked away. It wasn't just about charity. It was about silence, about complicity. I had no doubt left. They knew. Greg and his wife. The woman who had once held my hand when I was sick, who had helped me pick a prom dress, they knew everything, and yet they had stayed silent that night. They had made their choice. I didn't return to the motel. Instead, I found an all-night coffee shop, took a booth in the farthest corner, and opened my old notebook. I wrote it all down. Names, dates, addresses, connections. My thoughts twisted together like threads forming a map I never thought I'd have to create. At the center of it all was Madison Wexler, the woman who had lost everything just to speak the truth. The woman who had been buried by a diagnosis, her life erased. But I didn't know if she was alive. I didn't know if Maplewood Hills had even existed anymore, or if it had been renamed, dissolved, or just erased like so many truths. But I knew one thing I had to find out. So I began calling medical records offices, notary centers, and mental health facilities around the Harrow area. Most said no. Some claimed they had no records. But then there was one call, a woman at the state archives who paused when I asked about Madison Wexler. "You're not the first to ask about her," she said. Then she hung up. That answer chilled me more than anything. Who was the first? Did they find Madison, or did they disappear her? I didn't know what I was stepping into, but I knew this was no longer just about my identity. This was about a mother, silenced, a truth buried, and the past I was determined to unearth. 2 weeks passed before I found it. Maplewood Hills had closed in 2010. No website, no public files. On most maps, it was just a gray, unnamed patch. But there was an old forum post discussing psychiatric care. Anomalies that led me to a new name. Clear Haven Recovery Center. They had taken in special transfers after Maplewood shut down. I called Clear Haven from a payphone using a fake name I'd prepared. The receptionist was quick to shut me down. They couldn't share patient information. But when I asked about Madison Wexler, there was a pause. Then she transferred me to another woman. Her voice was calm, but cautious. "What is your relationship to Miss Wexler?" I said. "I'm her daughter." There was a long silence, 10 seconds at least, before she said, "You can visit, but only during restricted hours. You'll need to sign a no-recording agreement." I agreed without hesitation. The next morning, I took the 6:15 bus to the northern suburbs. Clear Haven sat at the top of a misty hillside, isolated like it had been deliberately forgotten. The building was old stone, overgrown with dry ivy, its entrance shaded by tall pines. The air smelled like damp wood and antiseptic, sharp and cold. The front desk gave me a short form to sign. Then I was directed upstairs, room 14, 15 minutes only. My heart pounded as I reached the door. I gripped the handle, inhaled deeply, and gently pushed it open. She was sitting there, a thin woman, her snow-white hair framing a gaunt face. She was sitting with her back to me, facing the window, where the sunlight filtered through sheer curtains, casting long, pale shadows on a stack of faded books. The room was so silent, it felt like the air was holding its breath. My heart thudded in my chest, loud enough to echo in the stillness. I whispered, "Miss Madison." She turned slowly. Her eyes, dark brown and deep, met mine, sad, heavy, but with something else. Recognition. Hope. I wasn't sure, but she didn't look away. I stepped forward every inch of the room, closing in around me as I sat down across from her. My hands trembled as I spoke, my voice barely a whisper. "My name is Katie." I paused. "You had a daughter 18 years ago." Tears welled up in her eyes, but none fell. She blinked, her gaze softening, as if hearing it for the first time, as if it hadn't been nearly 2 decades since she'd last let herself think of me. "I remember," she said, her voice barely audible but clear. "I never forgot." I pulled out the birth certificate and a stack of printed articles, placing them carefully on the table between us. I felt my chest tighten, as if I were revealing a secret. Even the air around us was too afraid to hold. "I found everything. I know you didn't leave me. They took me!" Her breath escaped in a rush, like she was releasing something she'd held in too long. She exhaled slowly, as if something heavy had been lifted. "They said I was paranoid, that I imagined things, but I knew too much." I waited, my gaze locked on hers, my pulse thudding in my ears. Then she continued, her voice steadier now. "This time, they tested drugs on patients. No one knew, no guardians, no consent forms." My stomach lurched. I could feel the truth crashing through the silence between us, forcing the air out of my lungs. I had to know more. "Greg Monroe," I said, my voice hardening as I forced the words through clenched teeth. "The man who adopted me, was he involved?" Her body trembled, not from cold, but from the very mention of his name. "He coordinated funding from the Vail Foundation," she whispered, her voice dark. "One of their protectors." When I was taken, your file was sealed. I felt my fists tighten, the blood rushing to my hands. One question sharp as a knife burned at the edge of my throat. Did he adopt me just to cover it all up? Madison didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving mine. You are living proof of a buried abuse case. They thought keeping you close would silence me forever. The air between us felt thicker now, as if the walls themselves were closing in, trapping us in a truth too dangerous to be spoken. I couldn't hold it back anymore. I started crying. Madison, hesitating for just a moment, reached out. Her hand, thin and cold, rested in mine. It wasn't warm, not like the embrace I'd dreamed of, but it was real, more real than anything I'd known. Be careful, she whispered as I pulled away, her voice faint. They still watch. It's been years, but people like Greg don't let go. I stood, heart still racing in my chest. A nurse knocked at the door. Time's up. I turned back, my footsteps faltering. I'll come back. I'll get you out of here, I promised, my voice raw with emotion. She didn't reply. She just nodded, lips moving in a faint whisper. I had to lean in to hear it. Never trust anyone in a white coat. The words, heavy with meaning, hung in the air, long after I left the room. I exited Clear Haven, just as the rain began to fall, light at first, but cold enough to bite into my skin. It wasn't a downpour, but it was enough to remind me that time wasn't on my side. With every step I took away from that facility, I felt like I'd opened a door that could never be closed again. Madison wasn't crazy. She wasn't a victim of her own mind. She had been silenced, and if I did nothing, I would be next. A few days later, I found myself back in the old library. My first stop on this journey, I sat in the same corner, surrounded by all the files I'd gathered. But this time, I wasn't searching for my roots. This time, I was preparing for a confrontation. In the pile of faded printouts, one name kept reappearing. Judith Campbell. She had been a nurse at Maplewood Hills from 1998 to 2010. An anonymous post on a psychiatric care forum mentioned her as the last one, the only one still willing to remember. It took me 3 days to trace disconnected phone numbers, abandoned email addresses, and dead ends before I found an old mailbox address in Michigan. I took a chance. I sent a handwritten letter, short, sincere, along with a copy of my birth certificate and an article about the Harrow Institute. I didn't expect a reply. Exactly 1 week later, I received an email from an anonymous address. I know who your mother is. Meet me Saturday at the back entrance of Larkspur Cafe, 10:00 a.m. Come alone. I didn't hesitate. The next morning, I caught the earliest bus to Michigan, carrying all my files and my notebook. Larkspur Cafe was small, quiet, tucked beside a weekend flea market. The back alley had a row of old wooden benches and a metal door that led to the basement. She was already there, gray hair, wool coat, a sharp face, eyes strangely alert. "You are Madison's daughter," she said. No hesitation. "I didn't waste time. I need proof, not a sad story to expose them." Judith paused, her gaze lingering on me. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out an old flash drive. Its label faded almost beyond recognition. GEHT. Pilot 1. This is a copy of treatment records. I stole before I left the facility. Judith's voice was steady, but her eyes were full of urgency. It includes med logs, patient codes, and a video Madison once kept as evidence. I took it from her, my hands trembling, a mix of hope and fear surging through me. "Is it enough?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, as if speaking louder might shatter the fragile thing we were holding on to. "Not yet," she replied, her gaze hardening. "But it's something they can't deny. Not back in the city." I knew then that this wasn't something I could do alone. I needed someone who understood the law, the media, and how to survive in a world where telling the truth was a dangerous game. One name came to mind: Marla Reyes, a former investigative journalist fired from a major network for pursuing a case tied to shady medical funds. I found her personal blog, a sparse thing updated only every few months, but packed with forgotten scandals, buried truths, and names that needed to be said aloud. I emailed her, my heart racing, the subject line stark and simple: I have video, internal documents, and the names of those holding my mother hostage. Less than an hour later, she called. "Joking!" Marla said, her voice deep dry and tinged with something raw. "A story like this cost me my career, but it could win your name back." She paused. "Meet me at the old studio, 3rd floor, 7:00 p.m. tomorrow. Bring everything and don't bring anyone." The next night, I walked into a dusty room that once had been a newsroom, now transformed into Marla's archive and safe house for truths no one else dared to publish. She booted up a computer. I handed her the drive, my fingers numb, and the video played. The footage was blurry, flickering like a forgotten memory. But there, in that dim, sterile room, a woman restrained. A doctor's cold, clinical voice asked about her post-injection emotions. Madison's voice responded, shaky but unmistakably clear. Marla's expression shifted, a look crossing her face. Something I couldn't place, something that spoke of the weight of the truth. "We've got something real," she said, her tone sharp. "But we have to do this right. Otherwise, people will disappear for good." I looked her in the eye, steady, despite the fear swirling in my chest. "If my mom had the courage to stand alone, I can stand in the storm. We'll expose everything. Every name. Every crime." Marla nodded, a small, grim smile forming. And so the battle began. Not with bullets, but with light. The light of truth aimed straight at places they thought no one would ever touch. "We didn't leak anything right away," Marla was clear. "If you want to bring down a system, you don't swing once and run. You hit from all sides at once before they can clean up the mess." Over the next 3 weeks, we worked like time was burning away, slipping through our fingers. Marla reached out to 3 former attorneys who had investigated medical ethics violations. I sent copies of the video and files to a whistleblower platform. Judith, the nurse, agreed to write an official statement attaching an old voice recording of Madison from a therapy session. By April 12th, everything went live. The video leaked online. A long-form article hit the homepage of an independent investigative news site. A podcast aired on unauthorized medical testing on vulnerable women, and then the names: Greg Monroe, Colin Harrow, listed as board members of the Vail Foundation. Social media exploded. What had started as a quiet story had turned into a movement. People whose loved ones had been held at Maplewood or Clear Haven came forward. A woman in Portland posted video of her mother being forced to take trial drugs. A leaked document revealed that the Vail Foundation funded a program called Female Behavioral Reconditioning. The phrase sent a chill down my spine. 3 days later, the state attorney general opened a formal investigation. Federal authorities stepped in. Police raided the Vail Foundation offices, and Clear Haven, Greg Monroe, and Colin Harrow were invited to cooperate, though. Their lawyers claimed that all accusations were baseless. For me, there was only one goal left: get my mother out before it was too late. We arrived at Clear Haven on a gray morning, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. Marla drove. Judith came with us. I brought proof. Proof that Madison wasn't just a patient. She was a victim. She had a legal next of kin. The intake staff hesitated when we presented the subpoena from the prosecutor's office, but when Marla handed it over, they couldn't refuse. Within the hour, my mother was brought out. Her silver hair was still there, but her eyes, no longer filled with fear. I took her hand, tight, Steady. Let's go home. Mom. Madison didn't ask where or why. She just smiled, the kind of smile that waited 19 years for a single moment. We didn't go straight back to the city. Judith had arranged for her to stay temporarily at a support center for former healthcare whistleblowers. For the first time in a long time, I could breathe. At the first court hearing, I sat in the back row, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. Greg Monroe walked in, no longer the quiet, controlling father who once forced me to eat vegetables. His eyes, those eyes that I had once trusted, no longer carried guilt. They were filled with fear. The prosecutor opened with the first piece of evidence, the video of Madison being interrogated in that locked room. Her face was confused, trembling, but I could see it, the resolve beneath the panic. The courtroom fell silent, every breath held. Then came the unapproved medication, logs, internal reports signed by Monroe and Harrow. Each document peeled back another layer of their carefully constructed masks. When the prosecutor said my name, Katie Monroe, the child illegally adopted during an internal whistleblower cover-up, someone gasped. I heard a pen drop. Marla gently squeezed my shoulder, her voice barely a murmur. You did what they thought was impossible. You shattered the silence. They built everything on. I didn't cry. Not because I was strong, but because I hadn't let myself rest. It was a silent mourning, the kind that lingers long after the grief has passed. Weeks later, an anonymous account sent me an email. The subject line burned into my soul. You are not the first, but you're the first to survive. Attached was one name, Rebecca Harlow, a former journalism student who had investigated Maplewood and vanished in 2012. I had thought Claire Rothman was the only one to ever touch this secret. But there were others, more truths still buried, I replied, asking to meet. One day later, I received a photo. A woman now living in Nebraska under an alias with short hair, glasses and cautious eyes, but unmistakable. Rebecca is alive. A month after the first hearing, I sat with Madison at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. She had started drinking coffee again. Black, no sugar, no cream. For the first time, I saw her smile. Soft, unguarded. Her face still bore the marks of years lost, but her eyes, those eyes were different, brighter, steadier. You know, she said, turning her ceramic cup slowly. Back then, I thought no one would believe me. No one. Everything they did was designed to make women like me look unstable. I knotted my throat tight. During those years, they didn't just strip you of your voice. They tried to erase your identity. They called you a complex case. The only thing you were guilty of was speaking up. We didn't talk much about Greg Monroe anymore. After being formally charged with 3 counts, abuse of power, falsifying records, and unlawful interference in the adoption process, he vanished from the news. His lawyer denied everything, but the evidence from Judith saved emails and the audio of him saying, "Keep the child to shut her up," was undeniable. Colin Harrow didn't fare any better. His license was revoked, and the federal investigation expanded to include every facility he had overseen. People who had stayed silent for years finally began to speak. Former patients, family members, even ex-colleagues who had once been too scared to question anything. Now they found each other in forum support groups, and most importantly, through the public release of documents. Marla, who had helped me every step of the way, was invited back to national television to talk about the case, but she declined. I didn't do this for the spotlight. I did it so girls like you don't have to walk through the dark alone. She agreed, however, to record an exclusive podcast where the story was told by me, by Judith, by Madison, and finally, by someone I never thought I'd find again. Rebecca Harlow. She reached out after hearing her name mentioned at the hearing. In her first email, Rebecca wrote only one line. I didn't get to finish back then, but I never gave up. We met at a community center in Denver. She was living under a new identity, but still held on to all the documents she had gathered back in 2012. Records, handwritten letters, copies of Madison's medical reports sent to a human rights group. She had been threatened, her laptop stolen, her bank account frozen. But she survived, and now she chose to step into the light with us. Together, we founded the Silence Breakers, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting victims who were unlawfully institutionalized, labeled unstable, just for speaking the truth. We offered legal resources, mental health support, and most importantly, a place where they could be heard. The media called us a quiet revolution in mental health care, but to me, it was simply one step toward justice for my mother and for the hundreds of others like her. I still keep the original birth certificate in my coat pocket, not to remind myself who I am, but to never forget where I came from. I was once blindfolded, treated like property, lied to. But I walked away from all of it, not just to survive, but to act. Someone once asked me if I regretted stirring it all up, confronting the people who raised me, who once called me daughter. I answered, I didn't stir anything up. I just uncovered the truth they tried to bury. My mother, now living in a small apartment near the coast, spends her mornings watering flowers, reading books, and sometimes writing letters to former Clear Haven patients, helping them reintegrate into society. One day, she left me a folded piece of paper. Inside was a handwritten line. You are the only reason I didn't give up. I didn't respond. I just folded it back and tucked it into my wallet next to the photo of us from the day she walked out of Clear Haven. We didn't say anything that day. We just held hands and stepped through the gates for the first time. That silence we left behind. It was the key to our freedom. My story isn't just about finding my birth mother. It's about reclaiming the truth and finding myself. From a girl pushed out of her home with nothing but a small bag and a blurry past, I rose to expose a system built on manipulation and psychological abuse that lasted for decades. I'm no longer Katie Monroe, the child they tried to hide, but the voice that chose to rise to defend those once forced into silence, and that to me is true freedom. What do you think about Katie's journey and the truth she uncovered? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to follow the channel for more powerful, emotional, and inspiring family stories to come.